The Patron. Jean Marin, born to a provincial bailiff, had ambitions of greatness. Like many other young men, he moved to Paris to study law in the famed Latin Quarter. It was here that he mingled with other students, most of whom enjoyed discussing politics over beers. Though Jean was often quiet during these discussions, he admired these outspoken classmates and stuck to them wherever they went, even treating them to drinks when he could afford it. After completing his law degree, Jean attempted to make a name for himself by taking on cases as a lawyer. Unfortunately, he lost most of the cases he took on. One day, as he was reading the morning papers, Jean was surprised to discover that one of his old acquaintances from the Latin Quarter had been appointed as a member of the French Parliament. Eager to reconnect, Jean sought out his former classmate and quickly resumed their friendship. He became what some might call a loyal lackey, the kind of friend who would run errands, handle unpleasant tasks, and never complain. Though Jean's friend often treated him as nothing more than a servant, Jean didn't mind. After all, he was close to someone important. As fate would have it, the former student-turned-deputy rose even higher in the political ranks and became a minister. Within a few months, Jean Marin's loyalty was rewarded. His friend pulled some strings, and Jean was appointed as a state councillor. This new title filled Jean with immense pride. At first, he was so overwhelmed with joy that he felt as though he had entered a new realm of existence. He walked through the streets of Paris, hoping that everyone could see the change in him, as though his new role was written on his face. He couldn't resist mentioning his title to anyone who would listen, no matter how mundane the conversation. Whether he was speaking to shopkeepers, newspaper vendors, or cab drivers, Jean would find a way to say, "As a state councillor, I believe." Or, "Since I'm a state councillor, I think." Having reached this new status in life, Jean felt it was his duty to help others. He offered his assistance to anyone he knew, sometimes even to complete strangers. His offers of help weren't just empty promises. He would take concrete action. If he ran into someone he recognized on the street, he would greet them with a warm smile, shake their hand, ask about their well-being, and then immediately offer his services. "You know, as a state councillor, I have considerable influence. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to ask." Then, without waiting for a response, he would invite the person to a nearby café, where he would pull out a pen, ask the waiter for a sheet of paper, and write them a letter of recommendation right on the spot. Jean wrote dozens of these letters every day, at cafés like the Café Américain, Tortoni's, and Café Riche, and sent them to government officials across Paris. From magistrates to ministers, Jean sent recommendations to anyone he thought might be useful. One rainy morning, Jean set off for the State Council. He initially considered taking a cab, but ultimately decided to walk. As he made his way through the streets, the downpour worsened, and soon he was forced to take shelter in a doorway. There, he found an old priest with white hair who was also trying to avoid getting soaked. Before Jean became a state councillor, he hadn't been particularly fond of clergy. But his views had softened ever since a cardinal had consulted him on a political matter. Now, he felt it was his duty to treat them with respect. As they stood in the doorway, Jean couldn't resist striking up a conversation. "This weather is dreadful, isn't it, Father?" he said, trying to seem polite. The old priest nodded. "Yes, indeed. It's especially frustrating when you're only in Paris for a short visit." "Ah, so you're from the provinces?" Jean asked, sensing an opportunity to offer his help. "Yes, I'm just passing through." "How unfortunate that it had to rain during your stay. For those of us who live in Paris year-round, the rain doesn't bother us much, but for a visitor like yourself, it must be terrible." The priest gave a slight nod but said nothing, clearly more interested in the rain that was starting to ease. Seeing that the downpour wasn't as heavy, the priest lifted the hem of his cassock, preparing to make a run for it. Jean, concerned, stopped him. "You're going to get drenched, Father. Why don't you wait a little longer?" The old man hesitated before replying, "I'm in a hurry. I have an important meeting to attend." Jean, ever the helpful patron, offered, "I insist, Father, let me walk with you and share my umbrella. I'm heading to the council anyway. I'm a state councillor, you see." The priest looked up at him, surprised. "Thank you, sir. I would appreciate that very much." Jean proudly took the priest's arm and began guiding him through the streets of Paris. As they walked, Jean couldn't help but give advice. "Watch out for puddles, Father. And be careful of the carriages. They'll splash mud all over you if you're not careful. Oh, and keep an eye on those umbrellas. People often poke others in the face without realizing it. Women are the worst offenders. They never seem to notice anyone else on the street and always take up all the space." Jean chuckled, clearly pleased with himself. The priest walked quietly, concentrating on avoiding puddles and splashes. After a moment, Jean, eager to continue the conversation, asked, "So, Father, are you in Paris for a bit of relaxation?" The priest shook his head. "No, I have some business to attend to." "Important business, I imagine? Perhaps I could help. As a state councillor, I have connections all over the city." The priest hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. "It's a personal matter, something between me and my bishop." Jean's interest piqued. "Ah, but I'm sure I could help. After all, the state council handles many ecclesiastical affairs. If it's something I can assist with, don't hesitate to ask." The priest reluctantly admitted, "Yes, I have to meet with some officials from the council today, Messrs. Lerapere, Savon, and maybe even Petitpas." Jean stopped in his tracks. "Why, those men are my closest colleagues. Let me write you a letter of recommendation. They'll certainly listen to me." The priest was taken aback but thanked Jean profusely for the offer. Jean, feeling quite pleased with himself, escorted the priest to the council building. Once inside, Jean took the priest to his office, seated him by the fire, and set about writing the recommendation letters. "My dear colleague," Jean wrote, "allow me to introduce and highly recommend a venerable priest, Father Sincha. He is in need of your assistance in an ecclesiastical matter." Jean handed the letters to the priest, who left with many thanks. The next morning, Jean woke up feeling content and scanned the morning papers. His smile quickly faded when he read a headline in one of the radical newspapers: "The clergy and government officials collude." The article explained that a certain Father Cincha had been accused of conspiring against the government and was suspected of various immoral acts. The newspaper lambasted Jean for supporting such a man and even recommended that the ministry investigate his actions. Jean, horrified, dressed quickly and rushed to his colleague Petitpas. "What have I done?" he stammered. "That priest tricked me." Petitpas shook his head. "You should have been more careful, Marin. You recommended a known conspirator." Jean, desperate to clear his name, promised, "I'll have him punished severely. I'll go to the Attorney General, even the Archbishop if I must." Jean quickly wrote a letter to the Archbishop, explaining how he had been deceived by the priest and how he wished to see justice served. As he finished the letter, he turned to Petitpas and muttered, "Let this be a lesson. Never recommend anyone unless you truly know them."
Thank you for listening. Like, subscribe, and share our channel Magic Mingle with your friends to enjoy more magical stories.